Welcome to the second part of the wolf tutorial. This time we'll be covering the UV unwrapping of the model. Unwrapping is the process of cutting and flattening a 3D model into a 2D layout that can be mapped with a texture. When creating a model, we need to unwrap it before applying the textures, as the unwrapped UVs are basically texture coordinates through which the software understands the position, rotation, and scale of the textures on each face. To unwrap an object, we would need to cut some edges on it, so that Blender would know how to unwrap it. As an example, if we were to unwrap a cube, we would want to cut some strategic edges, also known as seams, which would allow us to unfold it. This flattened version of the cube would be the unwrapped UVs. After you understand the concept, unwrapping simple 3D objects should become fairly easy. It gets a little more complicated when we need to unwrap an organic model, like a wolf for example, but let's get right into it. Since the last tutorial, I upgraded Blender to 4.0.2. Though you don't need to do it, it will probably make it easier to follow this tutorial, and we should always try to use the latest versions of Blender as there are new features available. Just make sure you have a backup of your projects. We will begin by unwrapping the body. So for now, we'll hide the teeth, tongue and eyes. Select the bottom teeth and then press Dot or Delete on the numpad. This will center the view on the selected object. Press and hold Shift, then left-click on the upper teeth and tongue to select them all simultaneously. Press H to hide the selected objects. Do the same with the eyes, select them, and then hide them. Select the wolf and press Tab to enter edit mode. Before we start marking the seams in our model, there are some rules we should be aware of. Usually, after the model is unwrapped and textured, there might be places where we can see the seams. We want to avoid this, and the first step to do so is to have the seams in places they are less likely to be seen, though it is not always possible to do so. In this particular case, we don't need to worry much about the visibility of the seams, since the model will have hair particles that will hide them anyway. Nonetheless, we will put the seams in strategic places, so they go unnoticed while at the same time do a good job at unfolding the mesh. We will start with the eye sockets. We want to select an edge loop around the eye socket, so turn on Edge Select mode, press and hold Alt, then select one of the edges of the loop. Now we want to turn the selected edges into seams. To do this, press Ctrl E, then select Mark Seam. After that, the edges will turn red, which means they are already marked as seams. If by any chance you make a mistake and mark a seam you don't want, just press Ctrl E again and select Clear Seam. Press E twice to deselect everything, then repeat the process for the other eye socket. We should mark a seam in the mouth, since there's no way we could unfold the mesh properly with the mouth connected to the rest of the body on the UV map. On top of that, the border of the mouth would be a good place for a seam. So press and hold Alt, then select a loop in the border of the mouth. Again, press Ctrl E, then select Mark Seam. Now we want to mark a seam on the lower part of the wolf's body. This is because we need to split the body so it can unfold on the UV map. The best place to mark the seam is on the bottom of the wolf's body, as the seam will be a little more hidden. So select the middle edge of the jaw, just in front of the mouth seam. Follow the edge loop and then press and hold Ctrl and select another edge of the same loop. This will select all the edges up to that point. Repeat the process throughout the wolf's body until you reach the tip of the tail. Time to mark our seam, press Ctrl E, then select Mark Seam. We will now work on the limbs. We will mark a seam around the place where the limbs are attached to the body, starting by the left foreleg. Press and hold Alt, then select an edge around the position where the leg is attached to the body. You may notice that the loop ends unexpectedly without going all the way around. The reason for this is that the loop ends at a vertex where there are 5 edges intersecting. When 3, 5 or more edges intersect at a single vertex, it creates what is called a pole. The most common poles are E-poles and N-poles. E-poles or extrude poles are vertices that consist of 5 intersecting edges. They are the most common, because they usually appear when extruding faces on a mesh. End poles or nose poles are vertices that consist of 3 intersecting edges. They are less common, but often appear when insetting faces, for example. Back to our model. We want to select more than one loop simultaneously. To do that, press and hold Alt-Shift and select an edge of another loop. Repeat the process and select all the loops until you go all the way around the foreleg. When it's done, mark the seam. Repeat the process for the right foreleg. Again, do the exact same thing for the hind legs. Now it's time to mark some seams in the paws. The paws are a good place to mark seams, since they will be on the ground most of the time, thus making it more difficult to notice the seams later on. Again, there are some poles on the paws, so we need to press and hold Alt-Shift to keep selecting the edge loops until we go all around the paw. Once again, press Ctrl-E, then select Mark Seam. Repeat the entire process for the other paws. We will now mark some seams around the wolf toes as well. Don't forget, every time you need to center the view around an object, vertex, edge or face, just select it and then press Dot or Delete on the numpad. In this case, for example, we center the view on the selected edge. So now we will select the edges around the toes and in the middle of them. Just remember to press and hold Alt-Shift to select several loops. When it's all selected, mark seam. If you feel the need to see if the seams are correct, feel free to press C and enter wireframe mode at any given moment. We will also mark a seam around the Dewclaw. Again, repeat the process for the other toes. Now, the forelegs and hind legs of the wolf are not ready to be unwrapped yet. We need to mark another seam. So we will mark seams in the inner part of the legs as they won't be as exposed. That said, select an edge in the upper part of the inner foreleg. Press and hold Ctrl, then select the bottom edge, right before the Dewclaw. Press Ctrl-E, mark seam. select the rest of the edges below the Dewclaw. Again, mark seam. Repeat the process to the other foreleg. Now we want to repeat the process for the hind legs. The only difference is that the hind legs don't have Dewclaws, so we will select the edges from the top of the leg to the toe. Then, press Ctrl E, mark seam. The toes are also not ready to be unwrapped. We still need to mark some more seams at the bottom tip of the toes. Select an edge in the tip of the toe, then press Dot or Delete on the numpad to center the view on the selected edge. Now we want to select the edges from the bottom of the toe to the tip of the claw. Again, mark the selected edges as a seam. Do the same to the other toes. For the Dewclaw, make sure the selected edges are the ones that stand inwards, so the seam will be hidden. Same process for the other toes, both in the forelegs and hind legs. It's time to mark some seams around the ears. Start by selecting a loop around the ear. Then press Dot or Delete on the numpad to center the view on the selected edges. Now, because there are some poles around the ear, we need to press and hold Alt-Shift to select multiple loops. Press Ctrl E and select Mark Seam. Now select the edges in the middle of the ear. We need to select the edges from the bottom to the tip of the ear. We could either mark seams in the front part of the ear, or in the back of it, but since the front part will be covered by the biggest hair particles, we can do it on the front side. Mark seams, then repeat the process for the other ear. Now onto the nose. The nose, like the ear, is not a big deal. We want to mark some seams around the nostrils, and although it's not strictly necessary, we will also mark a seam around the nose. This will allow us to increase the size of the nose in the UV editor, meaning it will be able to have more details in the texture, as it will be larger in the texture image. So let's start by selecting the edges around the nose. We will come across some poles, so we will have to select several loops. Then again, we can always mark a seam on each loop individually, without the need of selecting more than one loop at once. That's really up to you. When it's done, mark seam. To finish the nose, select a loop at the border of the nostrils and mark the seams. We need to mark a seam between the nose and the mouth. Without a seam in that area, the mesh won't unfold correctly, and there will probably be overlapping faces in the UVs. That said, select the edges from the nose to the mouth and mark them as a seam. To finish the seams on the wolf's body, we need to mark one last seam. To allow the inside of the wolf's mouth to unfold properly, we need to mark a seam that reaches at least halfway inside. So start by selecting the edge in front of the last seam we marked, and continue selecting the edges of the same loop until you reach the throat. Press Ctrl E. Mark seam. All the seams are now in place, and so we can proceed to the unwrapping of the wolf's body. Now we want to divide our viewport in two different areas. To do that, move the mouse cursor to the bottom left of the viewport. Press and hold the left button and drag the mouse to the right. We can also expand the bottom area a little bit, as we will use it later on. We want to change the area on the left. Currently it is set to 3D viewport, but we want to change it to UV editor. So go to the top left of that area, and change the editor type to UV editor. We also want to change the bottom area to shader editor. You may have noticed by now that the editor type is located at the top left of each area and can be changed anytime according to our needs. Now that we've defined the main areas, we can start unwrapping our mesh, but first we need to create a material. Make sure you are in object mode and have the wolf body selected. Then go to the properties panel on the right, select the material icon. Create a new material and name it checker, as it will be used to check if the unwrap is looking good. Hit enter. Now if we go to the shader editor, we will realize that there are two nodes that appeared as soon as we created the material. If you can't see the nodes, it might be because the shader editor is not set to object. If that's the case, change it to object. Quick explanation about nodes. Nodes are essentially blocks of data that contains the information about the materials. The nodes are connected to each other through inputs and outputs, and they work from left to right, meaning the first node on the left will contain the first information, then the second node will add some more information, and the third node some more, and so on, until we get to the final node, which should be the material output and the final result for our material. That said, the material we're creating is very basic, and it serves only the purpose of showing us how the unwrapping is performing. With that in mind, go to the shader editor area. We want to create another node. To do this, press Shift A. Select Texture, and then Image Texture. In short, an image texture node is used to apply an image as a texture. You can even load an external file like a JPEG or PNG. The principal BSDF is a default node that combines multiple layers into a single easy-to-use node, but we won't go into much detail on this one. We will now connect the color output of the image texture node to the base color input of the principal BSDF node. To do that, press and hold over the color output and drag it to the base color input. Now we need to create a new image, so press New on the image texture node. Go to the Generated Type drop-down menu and change it to UV Grid. We can't see the material in the mesh, and the reason for this is that we are in solid mode, so change the viewport shading to Material Preview on the top right. The Material Preview mode allows us to see in real time all the materials in the objects on the viewport. So now the checker material is visible on our wolf mesh. These black and white squares show us if the model is correctly unwrapped and how the textures will behave. Ideally, if the model was unwrapped correctly, we should have perfect squares in our mesh. So in this case, we can see that our mesh is not good. It is natural that it is so, because we didn't unwrap it yet, we only marked the seams. It's now time to unwrap our mesh, so while on the viewport and with the wolf selected, press Tab to enter edit mode. Press AE to select everything. You will realize that on the UV editor, the UVs will become visible as well as the checker texture. Now we can finally do the magic trick and unwrap our mesh. Press U and select Unwrap. For the record, if the unwrap doesn't look good, you might have to change the unwrap options from conformal to angle-based. If we take a look at the UV editor, we can now see the UVs unwrapped according to the seams we marked. On the viewport, we can see that the checker is looking way better, and we get those almost perfect squares around the body of the wolf. If the squares were smaller though, we could have a better understanding of how the material would behave. So on the image texture node, press New Image and change the width and height to 3000 pixels for example. Again, choose the UV grid on the generated type and press OK. We can now take a closer look at how the checker texture is behaving, especially around the seams. Now we need to rearrange the UVs on the UV editor so they are more ordered and easier to understand. Even though this is not strictly necessary to do, it's always a good practice. Press Tab to enter edit mode if you're not there already, and then press A to select everything. Each individual part of the UV is called an island and it can easily be selected. To do it, just place the mouse over the island you want to select and then press L. We can grab, scale and rotate the selection the same way we do in the viewport, G to grab, S to scale and R to rotate. Same as in the viewport, we can press A to select everything and AE twice to deselect everything. We can also press B to draw a rectangle selection. When rearranging the UVs, we should try to size them as large as possible, as long as they fit within the UV space. It is also important to understand that all the islands must be of the same scale, or close to each other. The reason for this is that if the scale differs too much, we may see a difference in the model's texture resolution later on. If by any chance you don't know which part of the wolf's body a particular island corresponds to, you can turn on the UV sync selection. This means that you can now select any part of the model in the viewport, and the respective UV faces will also be selected in the UV editor, and vice versa. You can also select the islands in the viewport, but to be able to do this, you need to turn on face select mode, and then press L over the part of the model you want to select. Let's put the toes together. That's about it, we have the wolf's body unwrapped. So now we will close the UV editor, as we won't need it for now. To do this, move the mouse over the bottom left corner of the viewport, right in the middle of the viewport and UV editor areas. Press and hold the left mouse button and drag it a little to the left and up, then release the mouse button and the viewport area will take up the entire screen again. The teeth, tongue and eyes still need to be unwrapped, so press Alt-H to unhide them all. Select the wolf's body and press H to hide it. Hide the teeth too, as we will start with the tongue. Select the tongue and press Tab to enter edit mode. Turn on edge select if it isn't already. The process is pretty much the same as it was with the body. Select some edges and mark them as seams. We want to mark the seams in places where they will be least likely to be seen, so under the tongue would be the ideal place. Select an edge in the tip of the tongue, right in the center of it. Press and hold Ctrl and select another edge of the same loop. This will select all the edges up to that point. Repeat the process across the tongue until you reach the back of it. Press Ctrl E. Mark seam. Now let's mark the seams in the upper teeth. Unhide all by pressing Alt-H. Press AE twice to deselect everything. Select the upper teeth, then press Ctrl-I. This will invert the selection, and so everything else but the upper teeth will be selected. Press H to hide the selected objects. Select the upper teeth and then press Dot or Delete on the numpad to center the view on the selected object. Press Tab to enter edit mode. Logically, we want to mark the seams that are on top of the teeth, because those will be inside the gums, hence completely hidden. There are some end poles in the teeth, so we have to press and hold Alt-Shift and select several loops, until we go all around the teeth. When all the edges are selected, mark the seams. Feel free to enter wireframe mode to make sure that all the seams are correct and that you haven't missed any edges. The marked seams are not enough if we want the teeth to unwrap properly, so we need to mark some more seams. On the front teeth, it makes sense to mark some seams on the sides because they will be hidden by the other teeth. One thing we can do is to select an entire loop, and then deselect the edges we don't want to be marked as seams. So press and hold Alt and select a loop. Then press and hold Shift and click on the edges you want to deselect. The canines must have the seams marked on the back, so they are not too exposed. Most side teeth can have the seams marked on the back or front, as the seams will be hidden by the other teeth. When you're done, feel free to enter wireframe mode to make sure everything is alright. Press Tab to exit edit mode. Repeat the exact same process for the bottom teeth. Start by unhiding all objects by pressing Alt-H. Select the bottom teeth, press Ctrl-I to invert the selection, and press H to hide all the selected objects. Enter edit mode. Again, mark the seams at the bottom of the teeth, and then proceed to mark all other seams. After all the seams are marked, press Tab to exit edit mode. Now it's time to work on the eyes. First of all, press Alt-H to unhide everything. Select the body, teeth and tongue, and then press H to hide the selection. Before we start marking the seams on the eyes, there are some small corrections that need to be made. The anatomy of the eyes we previously created is very far from the anatomy of real eyes. For this reason, we will slightly change the eyes so that they are a little closer, anatomically speaking, to real eyes. Simply put, what we're going to do is to turn the iris into a separate mesh and join the cornea and the sclera together in a single mesh. A good thing about this is that we only need to modify one eye, as they are linked objects, so by editing one of them, the other one will automatically be edited too. So first thing to do, select the cornea of the left eye, press H to hide it. Select the rest of the eye and press Tab to enter edit mode. Press A twice to deselect everything if there's anything selected, and turn on Face Select in the top menu. Now we want to select the iris of the eye, so start by selecting the smallest circle. Select the first face, then press and hold Ctrl and select the other faces. Now go to the Select menu, select More/Less. Then choose More. This will expand the selection. Do it one more time. We can see that the shortcut for this is Ctrl Numpad Plus. So we do it once again, but this time using the shortcut. We want to separate the iris from the rest of the eye, so press P to separate and choose Selection. Press Tab to exit edit mode. If we select and hide the right cornea, we can see that the changes made on the left eye took place on the right eye as well, since they are linked objects. We will now duplicate the iris and place the duplicate on the right eye. So start by selecting the iris object. Set the transform pivot point to cursor. Make sure the viewport cursor has the X, Y, and Z location set to 0. We want to duplicate the iris. But we need to create a link duplicate, so that if we need to change one of them, the other will be affected as well. So to make a link duplicate, press Alt-D. On the top menu, go to Object, Mirror, X Global. Basically, this will mirror the position and rotation of the iris symmetrically. The reason the iris is placed in the right place is because we have set the transform pivot point to cursor, so the mirroring is being done based on the cursor position. Unhide everything and hide it again except for the eyes. Select the right cornea, and then delete it by pressing X, delete. Now select the cornea, then press and hold Shift and select the sclera. Press Ctrl J to join the objects into a single mesh. Press Tab to enter edit mode. Turn on Vertex Select. Now if we move a vertex right in the point where both objects were connected, we will realize that both the cornea and the sclera are still open meshes, and for that reason there are duplicate vertices in the exact same place, which are the vertices from the cornea and the ones from the sclera. We want to merge all the duplicate vertices that stand in the exact same spot, and to do that, we will press A to select all the vertices, and then M to merge. Choose the option by distance. For the record, there is a menu after merging the vertices by distance that allows us to define the distance that the vertices need to have between them to be merged. By default, that distance should be very low, so the vertices have to be almost on top of each other to be merged. Now if we enter wireframe mode, we can see that there are two different objects. One is the sclera and cornea and the other is the iris. Because both eyes are linked objects, the right eye was also edited. The modeling is finished, so now it's finally time to mark the seams on the eyes. Select the left eye if it's not yet selected. Press Tab to enter edit mode. Press C to enter wireframe mode if you're not there already. Turn on Edge Select. Now looking at the mesh, we want to select the loop right where the cornea ends and the sclera begins. So press and hold Alt, and then select one of the edges of the loop. You might want to go back to solid mode. Press Ctrl E and mark the seam. Now we want to mark a seam that will cross the sclera from top to bottom. Press C to enter wireframe mode. Then press Tab to switch to object mode. Now looking at the iris object, we can conclude that there's no need to mark any seam, as the object is very simple and almost completely plain, so it will unwrap just fine without any seams. Feel free to select the right eye and enter edit mode, and you will notice that the marked seams are also there, because, once again, we edited the left eye, which is a linked object, and so the changes were automatically made to the right eye as well. Press Tab to get out of edit mode. Now we want to unwrap the teeth, tongue and eyes, so let's unhide everything by pressing Alt-H. Select the wolf's body and hide it. Now before we get into the unwrapping, I realize we didn't apply the scale to the teeth in the previous video, and that's something we must do, otherwise the unwrapping will have problems. If the scale of the object is correct, it should be 1 on the X, Y, and Z axis. For instance, if we select the tongue and look at the sidebar, we can see that the scale is correct. If we select the left eye, the scale is also correct. If we select the right eye, the scale is a little different though. The X value is negative, but as long as it's 1 there will be no problem. The reason this value is negative is because we mirrored the eye, so its rotation is reverse relative to the other eye, and that's perfectly fine. The upper teeth, on the other hand, are a different story. The scale is wrong and will certainly cause problems when unwrapping. To fix this, we need to apply the scale. To do it, press Ctrl A and select Scale. Select the lower teeth and apply the scale to them as well. Now we're ready to unwrap. Like we did before, move the mouse cursor to the bottom left of the viewport until the cursor changes its appearance. Press and hold the left button and drag the mouse to the right. Change the editor type to UV Editor on the top left. Change the viewport shading to Material Preview. We can either do it on the top right of the viewport like we did before, or by pressing Z and choosing the option Material Preview. Now we want to add the checker material to these objects. Select the lower teeth, go to the Properties panel on the right, select the material icon, and in the Material drop-down menu, select the checker material we created before. The texture is now applied to the lower teeth and visible in the viewport. Select the upper teeth and do the exact same thing. Do the same for the tongue and eyes. Feel free to do the same with the iris, you just need to change the viewport shader to wireframe so you can see and select it. Now press Z and go back to Material Preview. If we take a closer look at the checker texture on the objects, we can find many problems. There are few to none perfect squares, only crooked rectangles. This is expected since we didn't unwrap the objects yet. We want to unwrap these objects together, so press and hold Shift and select them all. We only need to select one of the eyes as the other one is a linked object. Make sure you don't forget the iris. Press Tab to enter edit mode. Select everything by pressing A. Press U to unwrap. As you can see, now the models are unwrapped, and everything looks much cleaner. Same way we did with the wolf's body, we need to rearrange the UVs on the UV editor, so they are easier to understand. Turn on UV sync selection so the selection is synced between the UV editor and the viewport. Turn on face select in the viewport, as that will allow you to select the islands by pressing L, otherwise you will select the entire object. Now let's rearrange the UVs. If you can't see the UVs properly due to the checker background, feel free to unlink the data block on the top menu. The base of the teeth will be hidden by the gums so we can scale down those UVs without a problem. That's it, our wolf is now fully unwrapped. For the record, we could have all the UVs together in a single texture, but having a texture for the body and another one for the eyes, tongue, and teeth gives us more control. Go back to object mode. Unhide everything. We don't need the UV editor anymore, so feel free to close it. We also don't need the checker material, so let's delete it from the objects. Select the wolf's body, go to the Properties panel, and under the Materials tab delete the checker material. Now let's do the same to the other objects. We might also want to change the bottom area back to timeline. If the cursor is out of place, make sure you change that on the sidebar View tab. Another thing we haven't done yet, and it's always a good practice, is naming the objects. So select the objects one by one and rename them in the Properties panel, Object tab. We can then see the renamed objects in the outliner panel on the right. This concludes the tutorial. So if you liked the video and learned something from it, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe the channel for more tutorials. Leave a comment, tell me what you think. Also, if you are curious to know what the finished wolf will look like, you can take a look at the video on my other channel where you can see some animations of the finished wolf. Thank you for watching.